Progressive Era took place between the 1890s and 1920s. The Progressive Era was highlighted by goals like ending corruption, modernizing science, suffrage for women, passing antitrust legislation, and counteracting the negative effects of the Industrial Revolution and urbanization. It probably shouldn't surprise you, but right before the Progressive Era was a time period called the Gilded Age. This era lasted between the 1860s and 1890s, right after the Civil War and Reconstruction. Mark Twain was actually one of the first people to name that time period the Gilded Age. Twain defined the Gilded Age as glittering on the surface but deeply corrupt below it. It was a time of robber barons, scandals, and corporate greed run amok. That kind of reminds me of right now. The progressivism after the Gilded Age is credited for a lot of the rights we hold for granted today. Here are just a couple examples of what progressives won 100 years ago and how it compares to right now. Number 1, Progressive Era labor rights. Labor unions grew rapidly in the Progressive Era. Child labor was limited and eventually stopped. Regulations eradicated workplace diseases like Fossey Jaw. States passed workplace safety laws and commissions investigated dangerous factory conditions and accidents. More so, President Theodore Roosevelt espoused the ideals of a progressive modernization of America, and labor leaders like Eugene Debs and Mother Jones rose to prominence, delivering fiery speeches and advocating for the rights of all workers. Efforts that eventually led to the New Deal policies of the 1930s. Labor leaders of the Progressive Era were real badasses too. One particularly ugly situation developed at Andrew Carnegie's Homestead Steel Works outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1892. Literal open warfare occurred between strikers and Carnegie's hired guards. Rifles and actual cannons were used in real battles between strikers and guards. In total, 10 people died. It should really definitely be a movie. The work of progressives and labor activists of the Progressive Era culminated with the Norris-LaGuardia Act of 1932. The act banned yellow dog contracts, which made employees promise to not join a union. However, it was quickly replaced in 1935 by the National Labor Relations Act, which established policy in favor of collective bargaining and union organizing. The period also saw the establishment of the National Safety Council in 1915, allowing committees to inspect and regulate working conditions. Today's labor fights are completely different, but still super important. Today, we have to fight for the Amazon workers who have to pee in bottles and are meticulously tracked by an all-seeing big brother of data and KPIs. We need our unions standing with us in the fight for increased wages. And most importantly, progressives and labor must come to an agreement on the Green New Deal that puts people to work, keeps wages high, keeps unions strong, and allows us to use the clean energy we need to survive as a species. Number 2, women's suffrage. Women have only had a constitutional federal right to vote for 99 years in this country. Actually, just in a couple months, we're going to hit the 100th year anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which officially gave women the right to vote. And though it took a long time, we finally had a full slate of women running for president this year. Shout out to the groundwork laid by Shirley Chisholm. But during the Progressive Era, the fight for women's voting rights was in full swing. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton led the movement when it began in the 1840s and 1850s. Support for the movement grew significantly during the Progressive Era. This was due in large part to the dual efforts of the moderate Nassau NAWSA and the more radical for the time NWP pro-women's suffrage groups. Amidst the women's suffrage movement, the Progressive Era also saw a sharp increase in the number of women working outside the home. It also saw the professionalization of homemaking through home economic curriculums in public schools, and in preparing women for careers outside the home. The dominant feminist perspective of the time was one that advocated for separate but equally important responsibilities for men and women. Thus, the idea of raising a family was made professional, efficient, and respectable. Activists of the time also helped win rights for widows and working moms. Progressives helped enact legislation that granted welfare to working mothers in 8 states by 1913, and nearly all of them by 1930. Progressives also pushed for public accident insurance plans. These plans provided widows and their families with a monetary payment to offset expenses. In 1920, of course, the 19th Amendment was ratified. After a long fight, the amendment gave women the right to vote across the country. It was the greatest success of the Progressive Era. It is also the largest extension of voting rights in U.S. history. Today, Donald Trump's president, and that's not super great for women, especially since he's an admitted pussy-grabbing sexual assaulter. And he loves attacking women on Twitter, especially women of color. Meanwhile, the GOP is doing everything they can to overturn Roe v. Wade. They control the Supreme Court, and we just found out Roe was a paid shill the entire time, so cool. Oh yeah, and women are still being paid less than men. And if you thought it couldn't get worse, there's a whole group of online losers called incels who think women owe them sex for no reason at all. Yeah, those guys are responsible for a bunch of mass shootings in the last couple years. However, there are still successes like the Me Too movement, which successfully got Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby and a ton of other people in trouble for treating women like shit and sexually assaulting them repeatedly for the past forever. And although the situation between Tara Reade and Joe Biden has completely fractured the movement, it did fundamentally change how women coming forward with allegations are treated, which is a good thing. And keep in mind, we only need one more state to pass the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, to make it a constitutional law. Number 3, fighting corruption with smart government. The Progressive Era won its first major victory with the election of Robert M La Follette to governor of Wisconsin in 1900. And although you've probably never heard of him, his ideas were critical to fighting corruption then, and we are still using them today to fight corruption and improve government. The progressive governor, La Follette, implemented a railroad regulatory commission, set fair freight rates, passed food safety laws, moved primary elections away from the control of party bosses, levied progressive tax rates, and introduced what became known as the Wisconsin Idea. The idea involved the utilization of experts in science, education, politics, and economics in the government's decision-making. In essence, the idea was experts plus not being corrupt equals better government. It's pretty simple, right? La Follette's anti-corruption and pro-expert successes took the nation by storm. In fact, future President Woodrow Wilson put La Follette's ideas into action shortly after becoming governor of New Jersey in 1911. And in California, Governor Hiram Johnson followed suit. The progressive Wisconsin Idea way of governing led to early workers' compensation programs, the breakup of corrupt political machines, progressive taxation, basic safety regulations, and eventually the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. The amendment took power from party elites and handed it to the people by calling for the direct election of U.S. senators. Up until that point, believe it or not, senators had been appointed. Today, we could use a little more Wisconsin Idea thinking, especially Republicans. The GOP is a political party that completely denies the scientific consensus that climate change is real and humans contribute to it. They also take a whole lot of money from the oil and gas lobby. Who would have thought? They are the exact opposite of the pro-expert and anti-corruption values of the Wisconsin Idea. And it's not just climate. All reports suggest more guns lead to more mass shootings. But the GOP would rather take the NRA's blood money than listen to the experts who know how to solve gun violence issues. Research, even Koch brother-backed research, suggests single-payer healthcare would save the U.S. money. But the GOP and plenty of Democrats take insurance company bribes to ensure their re-election campaigns are well-funded, rather than work for their voters. And let's not even get into the GOP anti-vax reps who deny reality and defy logic every day. Or the QAnon conspiracy theorists who just make shit up and believe random things and have never once been proven right about anything. Just like in the original Progressive Era 100 years ago, we're fighting a ton of corruption today. And a lot of it comes from anti-intellectualism and a complete disregard for experts, and a disbelief in science. And maybe like 100 years ago, again, we can convince people today that if you take real experts and you get rid of the financial gain and the possibilities for corruption, you can actually get some really good results. But the only way we can do that is probably leading by example, which means relying on Democrats today to do the right thing, which isn't always easy. Hence why back then there was a strong socialist party led by Eugene Debs. Check out my video on Eugene Debs. Number 4, the Progressive Era's policies that helped education succeed in America. During the Progressive Era, the number of schools in the nation increased dramatically, and so did high school graduation rates. The curriculum also changed thanks in large part to a progressive education activist named John Dewey. Activists like Dewey advocated for civics, democracy, pragmatism, and the use of public schools as institutions for social change. Enrollment in public schools for young children rose from 50.5% to nearly 60% between 1900 and 1909. Enrollment in public secondary school increased from 519,000 students to 841,000 students. School funds also increased substantially. The Progressive Era was the time period where school began to become a regular thing for American kids. Today, the fight for public education is once again raging. For the last several years, teachers have been walking out in protest demanding higher wages or supplies or fewer students in their classrooms, or just better working conditions. It's not an exaggeration to say the American public education system is a complete failure, and I witnessed the corrosion myself. I attended public schools when George W. Bush implemented his No Child Left Behind policy and erased funding for every school I ever attended. The fight for public education is a fight for funding dollars. We have to support striking teachers, demand more funding at every turn, and refuse to let public education dollars go to private schools. But the Progressive Era was not all positive, not by any stretch of the imagination. The progressive and labor leaders of the time were racist and held racist views. To many white progressives at the time, racial integration was a problem to be solved, not a goal to be achieved. Wikipedia sums it up. As white progressives sought to help the white working class, clean up politics, and improve the cities, the country instated the system of racial segregation known as Jim Crow. And I'm sure you've heard of Jim Crow. Early labor unions were aggressively anti-immigrant. Some progressives even supported eugenics-based birth control for lower-class and minority families. These ideas are and were gross. Luckily today, most progressives are deeply invested in racial equality and equity. Not everybody, of course, and there are issues and blind spots, but we have come a long way from 100 years ago. In conclusion, for a Progressive Era 2.0 to come into existence, for us to end this second coming of the Gilded Age, we have to learn from the past and from what worked and did not work 100 years ago. In short, a new Progressive Era has to be inclusive with intersectional justice and faith in experts at its core. It also means all races and religions and genders and aptitudes should be included at every stage. For the next Progressive Era to succeed, it must be fair, it must be smart, and it must be diverse. Thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like it, and please subscribe to this channel so I can keep making videos like this. Until next time, this has been Run It Back.